For joining me. Name is Philippe Langlois. This is going to be kind of a lighthearted, but hopefully informational kind of presentation, looking at threat modeling. So we've got a relatively small crew. I'll make sure that there's enough time for questions. But yeah, let's get started. So overall, obviously, you got to start with the stereotypical outline. Why are you guys here? Really kind of want to touch up in terms of why model, a handful of different models, and then how can we use these to help inform our defensive measures. So the hope is we can understand our defensive measures as driven by offense. So in the group I work at CIS, one of the main principles is the idea of offense informs defense. So what we're doing is really intend to mitigate what bad people are doing, or trying to do. So that's really kind of the hope and the foundation. And this is why we must apply Sun Tzu in everything we do in life, including business, war, love, and cybersecurity. Know thyself, know thy enemy, 1,000 battles, 1,000 victories. I love it. It's very positive. But the idea is really still true today. The better we can understand ourselves and the better we understand our opponents, the better chance we have of succeeding. So when we as defenders are tasked with protecting our environment and making sure that what we're doing is the right thing, there's a few things that actually kind of prevent us from knowing what that right thing is. And this is actually one of the most true statements, I think, in cybersecurity. And anyone else who here has done defense probably knows this. Cybersecurity from the defense side is a lot more like Groundhog Day than is like Independence Day. No point on the defender side are you going to have a big celebration for when you took down the mothership, you've had great success. There isn't that, right? It's more like Groundhound Day. You're facing the same problems day in, day out. It's the same issues that you're aware of plaguing you. So there's a lot of kind of similarities in that. So I think that's the beauty of the offense is that you have a time window, you succeed or you fail, and you move on to the next cool thing. In defense, it's really a day-to-day struggle. And there's also a lot of competing interests. We're talking about lack of resources. You have to convince management to give you money. You have regulations. A lot of people are telling you what you need to do, and they're going to ask you to prove what you're doing, that you're doing it. Then also, at some point, we also want to make sure we're doing the right thing. And there's a big difference between purely security and compliance. There's an overlap, but sometimes just because it's compliant does not mean it's secure, as any organization that has to go through PCI will admit. And then lastly, how do you know what you need to do? What are the basis for your defense, and how much do you need to do it? Is it need done for all your systems, every single piece, some systems, some of the times? And then also, how do you convince leadership that what you're doing is the right thing? And that's really not easy from the defender side to know what to do. Fortunately, there's some help. Knowing thyself is kind of that first part of the equation. It's about understanding your exposures, your environments, a lot of really good sets of cybersecurity best practice, such as these CIS controls, which we work on, really identifies kind of that being the first step for your organization. Is knowing your assets, knowing your software, your vulnerabilities, your administrators, your configurations. These are all parts and attributes of your environment. These are things that will not only help you defend, but will also help you detect when something goes wrong. All of a sudden you got a new application on your system, kind of weird. So it gives you an opportunity to look in terms of really understanding your own organization and your own exposures. And I love this comic, Defenders. I'm a big proponent. You gotta love the foundations, the core, the basic practices. But we often get sidetracked with the newest blingy box that promises to resolve all our issues if you just install it and you pay $100,000 a year. But when we start looking in terms of, from the attacker side, knowing our enemies, it's complicated because there's a lot of mystique, there's a lot of complexity associated with attackers. My favorite myth is that attackers are IT wizards. They are the brightest, most smart, intelligent people. This is how CrowdStrike represents their APT groups. How can you possibly defend yourself against a giant spider with green lasers coming out of its hands? Right? This kind of portrayal of adversaries, while it's great for marketing, it's unrealistic because, I'm not a Thor, right? How could I possibly defeat these APT groups? What could I possibly do to actually defend myself against these, these mystical wizards, voodoo wizards, and panda horse rider? I'm sure someone here knows what the titles are for each of these groups. There's also the idea that attackers are unpredictable, right? They're artists, and I think there's actually a talk happening now or earlier. Did anyone attend that? Hackers as artists. I really wanted to attend that because I'm Bob Ross here, waking up, send a little 0-day or phishing email. The idea that we can't really predict what they're going to do, that's not necessarily true. We can't always know what they're going to do, but they have a process. And these are people that work in organizations, the ones, the APTs that are hired, they have managers, they have timelines, they have a set of tools and processes that they're comfortable with, that they've used before, and they know they're going to have some level of success. So they're going to want to use that. And they're going to want to use what's within their comfort zone. And also that, once again, the idea that attackers have bottomless resources. They have deadlines, right? They have mission space, and if they can't achieve their objective through you, they're going to go somewhere else. Unless you are that super critical and unique objective that they can only reach through you. And then also, lastly, the idea, attackers only need to be right once. That's not true, right? They have, once again, it's a process. If we look at our Lockheed kill chain, which I'll talk about a little later, it's a series of steps that they have to do. And they have to go through, and each step there's an opportunity for failure, right? And our job as defenders is to make them fail, is to make it hard for them, and to make them have to go spend more money. I think, honestly, from a defender side, if someone has to go burn a 0-day on us, wow, we made it hard for them. Like, that's a level of success in its way, because that's a large investment for an organization to go and research a 0-day and then implement it within the organization. So there's, there are definitely some ways in which we can make it harder. So you ask yourselves, how can we really understand our enemy? From the simplest, we can read Brian Krebs on security, right? It's the basis, and learn all the people that had the misfortune of being on the receiving end of an attacker. We can also learn it from reading vendor reports. A vendor will produce this normally as marketing material, but there's a lot of really good information in terms of trends, right? What type of attacks are they using? What are they, what successful? Of course, how many phishing emails go out? Deep size of DDoS attacks. We can also learn by buying all the threat feeds in the world, hiring some very expensive threat intelligence analysts to make sense of all of it and produce intelligence products for an organization. That's difficult. It's not for everyone. It's for certain levels of organizations that are at that maturity level. And of course, really the best way is to learn firsthand by getting compromised. Right? You're going to really get a really quick introduction as to how APTs and systems like that work. Obviously, it's sarcastic. Not really the ideal way to go about this. So, Sun Tzu. Actually, pull my phone, make sure. Ah, sweet. I can actually breathe. Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. So what I'm really trying to talk about is, in a very roundabout way, is why do we model? Like, why do we care about creating some form of threat model? Well, really the idea is that it allows us to create a standard view. I want to understand attackers the same way you understand attackers, and I also want to be rigorous. We all come in with our assumptions, right? We have biases in terms of how we view the cybersecurity landscape. So if we can come up with a model, and we can challenge our assumptions, and we can be thorough in what we're looking at and kind of going through the process. And most importantly, we can identify commonalities. If we're classifying our threats in the same way and their tactics in the same way, we can find out what their critical path item is into our environment. If we found all of a sudden 90% of attackers are using a similar method, that warrants us looking into how we can prevent that specific method. So we can only do that if we have some standard way or some standard language to describe. And as mentioned, being rigorous, I love data, love doing data analysis. Having a standard language is huge for being able to make those cross mappings, being able to make things work. So we're going to be checking out 4 models. First of which is Stride, Lockheed Martin Kill Chain. MITRE attack model, and then last, our own community attack model. So threat modeling has been around for a little while in different shapes. I think Stride is one of the earlier ones, and definitely one that's worth looking into as kind of our starting or foundation. So Stride was created by Microsoft in, I think, the early 2000s, and it's really part of their software development lifecycle. And the idea is, as you're building software, you need to work out all the different ways threats can manipulate your system or get your software to do things you don't really want it to do. It's part of the awesome book by Adam Shostak, Threat Modeling, Designing in Security. This is a very good book. Highly recommend it if you're interested in threat modeling. It's 400 pages of deliciousness. It's really focused for applications and software. It's kind of its origins, but networks and our environments really are kind of system of systems, right? If we can understand our environment as a series of processes, then this can be applied to it. So the real focus of the Stride framework, which is different from the other ones we'll be covering, is that it actually starts from behind. It starts at the end and says, what can go wrong? You know, what is possible on my application to go wrong? And as I'm going to introduce a lot of wonderful acronyms. So Stride actually stands for these things that I'll go through. Really, once again, focusing in terms of, from the application standpoint, what can go wrong. So the first of which, spoofing. I think we're all pretty familiar, right? You're pretending to be someone else, another process, another user. How can that be done within your application or your environment? Also looking at things such as tampering, right? So how can people actually go and change specific values on my system or my database? That's the integrity part of our CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Repudiate, how to actually make sure that there's some level of trust in what is happening in my system and that users are actually being tied back to their own actions. So we can actually, non-aggregation of what's happening on the system. Especially important if you're doing anything in finances. Someone is actually proved to be able to send the money. Information disclosure. This is the traditional C in our CIA, the confidentiality, what bad stuff, how can you get the information out. Denial of service, the A in our CIA. And then lastly, escalation of privileges. So how can a user go and be able to increase their privileges, or even a process increase its privileges? And once again, this is really looking from the application standpoint. We've used it for individual applications in our environment, where we go through and say, okay, based on what we know, how could someone spoof a user or a process? And here's the really cool thing about this methodology. We talked about team sports. Security is a team sport. This methodology is not intended to be the cybersecurity analyst sitting back and saying, well, this is how I can spoof it, blah, blah, blah. It's really about engaging the engineering team, right? Engaging the people who are most knowledgeable in these processes and these tools to not only document what can go wrong, but also what's already in there to stop it from going wrong. And then you can kind of work together as a team to identify, well, where are the major gaps and how can we address them collaboratively. So once again, cybersecurity really is a team sport. And this is one of these perfect team exercises. And you actually get the book, you can get flashcards where you can go and you can basically create a scenario and flip a flashcard and say, spoofing of users, how can that be done? And you work through it as a team in terms of preventing, what's the best defense against this technique? Do we have in place? And if we don't, how can we put it in place? The next one is the Lockheed Martin kill chain. This is perhaps one of the first papers that really looks at the attack as cyber attacks in form of a kill chain process. So this is right off one of their seminal works called the Intelligence-Driven Computer Network Defense Informed by Analysis of Adversary Campaigns and Intrusion Kill Chains. So it's actually a really good paper, came out in around 2009. And it looks in terms of one of the models that one of the, in principle, security architects at Lockheed Martin created to help understand from an adversary side and the defender side, what's the conjunction between the steps the adversary has to do. And the novel aspect of it was really understanding that an attack is a combination of different steps. It's not just one thing. It's each step, and if you interrupt a single one of those steps, it disrupts the whole chain. Right? That's why it's called a chain. You know, a chain's strong on that strongest weakest link. That's really the idea behind the kill chain. And then they broke it down into 6/7 different steps that an attacker has to do. So the first step is reconnaissance, right? An attacker has to go and they have to identify, you know, where are they going to send that phishing email, which services can they exploit, you know, which possible issues in the website or, you know, SQL injection vulnerabilities. So they'll spend some time conducting reconnaissance. And from there, they'll have maybe an idea as to, you know, what kind of applications are running in the environment, who might have the keys to the kingdom, and they're going to weaponize. They're going to create some form of exploit, some form of tool that they're then going to deliver. And then from there, you know, it's going to be an exploitation chain, you know, either against the user or whatever specific vulnerability they're going to be looking to exploit, with installation of malware. And then there's a C2 component, in which the malware has to connect back for the, you know, malicious actor to control it, and then they achieve their mission. This is, you know, relatively high level if we think about it. It doesn't look at specific techniques. It looks like kind of broad strokes. But the neat thing is you can start looking at your defense. So they're using kind of traditional, I think it's 6 Ds, which is very kind of DoD style. Looking at what are the things security controls do, right? You can deny, detect, disrupt, deceive, and destroy. Interestingly enough, there's nothing in destroy, because that's really kind of an old school military thinking. You don't destroy much in cybersecurity, unless we, you know, start calling in drone strikes. But the idea is you can look at your controls within this framework, and you can see, you know, where is there duplication in where I'm putting my defenses. You know, do I have sufficient coverage to be able to disrupt weaponization? You can't really disrupt weaponization, right? You can't really disrupt reconnaissance. That's happening all the time anyway. And weaponization, these are all things that happen outside your environment, but what are the things you can do to kind of help you defend yourselves? So this is actually used by a couple large organizations in the financial industry to really identify where do they put their investment. And then also when you're a big organization, you gobble up a lot of other organizations, you inherit a large amount of their IT. So all of a sudden you have, you know, 5 things that are doing the same thing to detect exploitation. So is that necessarily the best investment for your organization? You make considerations and reinvest your money depending on, you know, a specific process in the kill chain that you find isn't being addressed sufficiently. Sweet. All right, MITRE ATT&CK framework. Is anyone familiar with MITRE ATT&CK? Of course, the people I've already preached about this. Okay, I will convert everyone into loving the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So this is a relatively new product by MITRE, and also perhaps the best acronym possible. It stands for Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. And it's really intended to provide a descriptive way of looking at what adversaries are doing. And when I mean descriptive, I mean down to the keystroke that you need to do to implement it. So it's the core pieces of the MITRE ATT&CK model are found in the technique and tactic. So that's the blue and the yellow. So the tactic is a short-term tactical goal, which, if you were to look at our old kind of Lockheed Martin, is that step in the process, right? Is I want to escalate my privileges, or I want to maintain persistence. Right? These are short-term goals that help you achieve your long objective. The techniques are the means of which you can achieve that. So how can I escalate my privileges? How can I maintain my persistence? How can I exfiltrate data? And the neat thing is you start looking at the adversary groups. So they're using open source intelligence. So all those really fancy vendor reports by FireEye and the likes, like Symantec. You know, they'll describe the techniques used by adversaries. They'll describe the tools. And what MITRE does is they're standardizing it according to their framework. So they're going to say APT group 28 uses power split to, access tokens, or uses power split or puppy or whatever to achieve a specific, technique. This allows us now to look across all the different APT groups. We can start looking at the specific techniques that they're using. So the neat thing about this, I'm going to say neat things, I really like this specific framework, is that it allows us to actually test our defenses. So as mentioned, each of those techniques and those software are documented, right? So you can actually go hands on keyboard and say, I'm going to try all the techniques found within escalation of privileges. Will my detection pick it up? Will my HIDs pick it up? Will it get caught? Will it get prevented? So you actually now have an objective way of measuring and testing your defenses based on a framework. It's not the best framework, but it's a good framework. And it's all based on techniques that are actually being used today. They've also released some other really cool things. Pre-attack, which is looking at, some would say, left of boom. The idea is all these activities that happen before they even send you malware. So all the reconnaissance that they have to do, all the weaponization. So there's actually a framework that describes all that activity that says, how do they conduct open source intelligence, right? How do they identify your lead network engineer, right? They'll use social media or something like that, And they'll find that information, they'll exploit it to then target them. Attack for Enterprise is really looking at this process overall for organizations. They even break it down by platform. So you can understand the techniques for a Windows operating system versus the techniques for a Linux system versus the techniques for Mac OS. And then lastly, there's the attack mobile profile, which looks specifically at how can you achieve the similar objectives except on a mobile platform, on an Android or an iOS. And that was actually written by one of our coworkers, Josh Franklin. So here it is. It's an eye chart, obviously, because there's a lot of data involved. But what's really important is first, there's a website you guys can go and get this information. There's also an API if you want to pull it. At the very top, we have our tactics, right? So this is the short-term goals. We have initial access. So how do I get my foothold in your environment? My execution, how do I get you to run my code? Then you have credential access, discovery, how do I find all your juicy little secrets? Lateral movement, how do I go across your environment to gain access to more cool stuff? Command and control, and then the last you just kind of cut off is the achieving the objective, right? Am I exfilling data? Am I going to send a ransomware everywhere? And then for each of these tactics, you have the techniques listed. And none of these will probably surprise you. It's actually a really good way to do a sanity check in terms of all the different ways bad stuff can happen. Initial access, a lot of these really aren't surprising. Drive-by compromise, we're all pretty familiar with that. You guys probably never heard of this spear phishing emails. I don't know, I think it's pretty cutting edge right now, right? Even replication through USB devices. These are all things that we're all aware of, but it's nice to have a list, right? This is all the ways that we can document so far that we know that people can get access to our systems. Here are all the ways people can execute their code, our environment. So as we're going through each of these techniques, there's actually a lot of additional information. I definitely want to say that this is kind of based on one of the Wikipedia clones. This is community built. So there's additional content that from your expertise or your experiences that you want to add. That's awesome, right? And you can help build this corpus of knowledge for everyone to benefit from. So I'm definitely more a fan of tactics, techniques, and procedures than MD5s, IPs, and domains. I think that's where we need to be more diligent as cybersecurity experts, is to promote the larger strategic discussion of cybersecurity and not focus in terms of individual IOCs, which are rapidly changing. So for each of these techniques, there's a narrative element. They'll say, basically how does this happen, who used it, system requirements. This is really cool. They will tell you for that specific technique, do you need to be an admin to run it? Do you need to be a system to run it. So that helps you understand in terms of, well, what are the initial ways they can escalate their privileges? Are they going to be able to do it directly in the box, or do they have to pivot to the main control and then dump credentials from there? Examples will include, the groups that use it, the APT groups, which tools. So, like I mentioned, PowerSploit is mentioned as one of the tools that's tied back to the different techniques, along with Mimikatz. This, obviously implements one of the techniques. Poppy, which is now, I think it's pronounced Poppy. So all those Python libraries end with PY. Poppy is another Python-based backdoor. RAT. Also mitigation. So when you're looking at mitigation, you really kind of have two forms of mitigation. We're talking about configuration, right? So some users allowed to write somewhere which they shouldn't be able to, that then allows be able to escalate the privileges, or you're able to do whatever bad thing they need to do in that system. Or sometimes you need tooling, right? Sometimes you can't configure the problem away. You need to have a specific tool monitoring it, or a specific tool trying to block that access point. Detection. This is also a very unique thing that they've been adding, is data sources. So I'm interested in being able to find out when this technique is happening. What tools are going to tell me that this is happening? File monitoring, is going to be my network logs. What's going to tell me that this is happening, that I can detect it? And of course, references, because like all of academia, we got the cite our sources. And the nice thing about attack is that there's actually a community around it now. One of them, this kind of lesser known one, is Unfederer. So that allows you to basically take a self-assessment based on something called the CIS controls, and then also tie it back to the MITRE attack model to understand in terms of where your gaps are, and also identify which analytics would help you detect the specific techniques that you're not mitigating or that you're at risk of. And you can also say, I'm super concerned about APT group 28 because I work in elections field or something like that. And you can pre-select and identify what is their chain process, and where am I missing specific tooling or specific capabilities in that process. If you're a fan of sticks, which I know everyone loves it, awesome format, they actually converted all their data into the sticks format. So you can pull it down kind of that standardized fashion. So they did a mapping. And then this is kind of the newer collection of tools. It's automated testing. So like I mentioned, each of these tools, or each of these techniques, you can actually run the commands, and it's documented. So there's a handful of tools that will actually automate this process. Do not run these on production systems under any circumstance, because the whole point is to compromise your system and detect and see if your defenses can actually detect it. But if you have some box that has all your tools on it that you're using, go for it. Caldera is the one that's made by MITRE. It's actually a very robust tool. It will create a randomized kill chain process using the techniques, and then it has basically an agent on the system that will then execute that process. So that's a good one, kind of like the chaos. You don't really know what's coming, but something's coming, and can you actually detect it? Then last, we also have the Atomic Red Team. So this is done by Red Canary Security. It's basically a GitHub repo that has every technique and every test identified for each of the techniques. So you can go through and say, this is how I run this process. And an APT simulator, which if it's kind of the lazier version, it's a batch run. And it has all the exploitations, so you literally just click on it, run as admin, and then it will run through all the tests it has. It doesn't have coverage for all the tests, because some of them are really bizarre and require you to inject DLLs and things like that. But it runs a good chunk of them, and at least a good way to get started, and at least in an automated fashion to really identify your strengths and weaknesses. Sweet, I'm good. All right, community attack model. So this is kind of our approach at looking at the problem. So CIS, for those who don't know, we're very big on the community. All our content and most of our services are actually built by volunteers in the community. So the CIS controls, which are also previously known as the SANS Top 20, they're all built by cybersecurity experts, cybersecurity professionals who are passionate about the topic. And they come together and they collaborate on developing this content. It's the same idea with the community attack model, is you really want to create a kind of a central place in which we can identify what are the major themes and major processes that adversaries are taking, and what are the major techniques, and then provide a tool that people can go and say, you know, this is how my defense is mitigating this community attack model. Still a work in progress, like everything. It's never done. But we're really looking in terms of understanding how can defenders disrupt the attackers kind of in 5 different ways. Identify, so how can we see what's going on? Detect, I want to know what's happening in my environment. Protect, respond, and recover. For any of us in the compliance field, this shall sound familiar. Where does this come from? NIST, thank you. So these are the security functions found in the NIST cybersecurity framework. We like continuity, we like to be able to tie into other frameworks. And it kind of looks like, the empty version looks like this. So our attack stages are in between essentially kind of the Lockheed Martin model, which has those 5 steps, and then MITRE, which has those dozen steps. So it's really kind of a mid-tier level of abstraction. We want to be able to provide sufficient level of detail that organizations can actually tie to what's happening, but also we don't want to drown people in information. So this is kind of our first cut at it. Once again, we're looking at it as a process. We have the reconnaissance, the weaponization. That's all our kind of our pre-attack steps. We've got our delivery. We're going to send you something. Get the exploitation, misuse. Escalating your privileges. That's a very key step, right? I need to be able to access more than just what the user can do. So if you're running an environment, don't let people run as admins. Just give them that extra step for bad guys. You'll thank me later. Lateral movement, I need to move across my environment. I need to be able to go and get to where the goods are, because I'm not necessarily going to go right away to where all the nice information I really want is. And then, at the very end, we have our mission objectives. So for the initial reconnaissance, a lot of different techniques, right? You can be looking at the people, the technology. I want to know where I can send my phishing emails. I want to really have a target list, right? And oftentimes in some teams, there's different jobs for these steps, right? There's one person that's really good at ASIN, and he's going to go and give me a list of email addresses and domains and potential targets, and he's going to hand it off to someone else to then do the exploitation. And then we start looking at, what are kind of the things we can do to mitigate it. I'm not super convinced a lot of these are actually going to be super effective, because a lot of this activity happens completely outside your environment and is basically network noise, right? You're going to get poked and prod, and people are going to research you just like any other system on the internet. It's very hard to detect when is it going to be a target attack. But there's definitely things you can do, like having a firewall in place, basic things, at least blocking things. Respond if you want to have a honeypot. That can sometimes be helpful to at least get an understanding as to who is intentionally probing you. When you can make it a little harder, a little inside. I'm a bigger fan of internal honeypots than external, because you can get a lot more value out of the internal ones. In terms of acquiring the tools, there's really not a whole lot we can do here, right? Unless you're a nation state and your job is counterintelligence, for us as the regular eons of the world, this is really not what we do. But from the adversary side, they're going to build in-house tools, right? They have some developers. They're going to build a really cool backdoor, rat or whatever. There's also increasingly more use of open source tools, as I'm sure Intel team could vouch for. And the reason why is it makes attribution harder, right? Because anyone can download PowerSploit or Empire, and there's still relatively effective tools. And then, part of the weaponization really isn't just the malware, right? It's the infrastructure they have in place, the exploit, and then how they actually stay in the system. So in terms of being able to identify it, threat intelligence might be useful if you can get part of those very useful feeds. And hardening your systems based on the configurations is definitely a good start. So delivery mechanisms, none of these are going to be particularly surprising. You're looking at things like email, drive-by, water hole attacks, social engineering, malicious USBs, direct network. You've got a vulnerable SMB server. I'm just going to connect to it and send you my exploit. This is where you start looking at, really how can you filter these things out? Continuous vulnerability assessment's an important one of these when you're talking about your networking devices and also on your end systems. You want to be able to identify your vulnerabilities, remediate them before adversaries identify it, and then remediate for you, right? So it's really about being able to go and have an understanding of your environment before they do. So once again, one of the key secrets of cybersecurity is good management. So a lot of these are really management controls. Knowing your vulnerabilities is definitely a management style thing. Initial compromise, how they get the foothold. So they sent you something, you got past your email filters, it's got past your 15 firewalls. They're just going to exploit code. It's going to either exploit vulnerability in the code, or it's going to exploit poor configuration. And then, can users run untrusted macros? And macros is huge right now, and the Intel team can probably validate. Are huge, have been huge, and probably will continue to be huge. And then from here, in terms of our ability to protect, you're really looking at patching, hardening your systems using some standard configuration, like STIGs or CIS benchmarks. That's the only plug. Whitelisting, data execution protection. These are all the types of controls you can. And as you're going through the process, you can say, okay, I have patching, I have some hardening, I have HIPs, and I can do my containerization. I can understand the text in that way. But really it's about, for the adversary side, it's about establishing the foothold that they can then go and do what they need to do, which is probably going to be misused or escalated privileges, right? So they have access. Normally if you're coming in and you're doing based on best practice, your users are not going to be running as admins. So then they need to get to admin levels, because a lot of the persistence mechanisms actually require admin level credentials, require to have the ability to go and actually write new services or create new processes like that. So to be able to kind of identify it, there's different ways, definitely having a control or an idea or some monitoring of your account, your admin accounts is definitely a good start. Just generalized control, hardening configuration, a lot of the hardening guidance is really about defining what an admin, what a user can do, right? It's really about delineating that, and a lot of the benchmarks and the STIGs is really about saying, yeah, users really shouldn't be able to use these functionalities. Users really shouldn't be able to write in these directories. And that's a large amount of those type of recommendations about carving out what is intended to really be administrative versus what's intended to be a general user. So the goal as a bad guy is I want to get more access. I want to have system, or I want to have root, or whatever, so I can do whatever I want in your system. It's no longer your system. Internal reconnaissance, I want to have a better understanding of your environment. I want to be able to go and I want to identify how you're architected. Interesting stories. There's been times in incident response where the incident responders found very detailed network maps and diagrams on compromised servers, of which said, wow, you have really great documented networks, of which they responded, that's not ours, that was the bad guy. So they will actually, having an idea of your environment, if you don't have a good understanding of it, they will have a good understanding of it. They will map it out. This is where you need to have your inventory of hardware, right? Your inventory of software. You need to know what's exposed if a specific system is compromised. Network segmentation, right? You don't have a flat environment where everyone has access to everything. Do your users really need to have access to all your HR data? Well, probably not. And then account monitoring, network monitoring, right? Because they have to do some level of scanning. They may just do passive scanning, which is a lot harder to detect. But there's ways in which we can kind of disrupt that. And it's really about understanding the users, enumerating the data, and other systems. One of the cool tools I probably should have mentioned that does this is Bloodhound. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Bloodhound. It's really about kind of enumerating the users and the different trees to identify what's your closest path to administrative privileges? Lateral movement, right, it's kind of the next step. I'm going to use my stolen credentials, I'm going to use existing management systems, I'm now use my higher access, and I'm going to move around your environment, right? They may continue to exploit internal vulnerabilities, which is still very common. So you have to patch your external systems as well as patch your internal systems. So this is a little harder, but there's definitely things you can do. Configuration, network segmentation, once again, just makes it harder for them. You have to make them work for it, right? The more steps in the process, the more chance there is for them to get disrupted. And then persistence mechanisms, Trojans, admin accounts, service accounts, right? They're going to either log in back legitimately or they're going to have a malware that beacons back. There's a bunch of other processes, but really this is about knowing your egress filtering, you're monitoring your network, and you're trying to protect your hosts. And lastly, they're going to pwn you, right? They've gotten the process, they've gotten in, they're able to identify where the data was they wanted, they're able to exfil it. We're going to try to make sure we can stop that by having some good planning, looking at network segmentation, data protection, try to prevent people from being able to access this, and hope for the best that they can't actually achieve this goal. I mean, they did what they want to at that point. So, but really the idea is not to go through every process, but to understand that we can put our defensive measures in a framework like this to really understand and identify what are the key things we need to be doing based on what adversaries are doing. With that, I am more than happy to take a few questions. Sure, Chris.
What's your favorite attack model?
What's my favorite attack model is the MITRE ATT&CK model. I like it, especially because it provides that beautiful mix between very detailed technical data along with kind of some higher level abstract data. So I think the more we can abstract from the lower up, the better we can really understand how our defenses mitigate these specific attack patterns. So there's definitely work to be done in the field. The MITRE model provides an extensive library of all things adversaries have done and can do. I think there needs to be a need to incorporate more larger trend data for us to understand what do we really need to be doing based on overall trends in the space, essentially. Yes?
Is there somewhere where I can contribute if I know something or anything at all?
Yep, absolutely. So if you're interested in contributing, which is a question, got it. If you're interested in contributing, you can actually contribute to the ATT&CK website. It's a wiki-style platform, so you can go and contribute there. We also, at the CIS, we have our workbench site, which is where all the collaborative communities exist. It's free to sign up, and you get access to help develop the controls content along with any of the benchmarks. So it's definitely something we're interested in doing more with the CIS controls, is directly tying the controls to specific attack techniques, just to make these connections more explicit and easier for people to understand. If I'm not doing X, what does this allow the adversary to do on my system? Sweet. Well, thank you so much. It's been an honor.